October 25th, 1944, Surigao Strait, Philippines. In the pitch-black veil of the largest naval battle in history, USS West Virginia, a 21-year-old American battleship, once sunk at Pearl Harbor, detects the Japanese fleet at an unimaginable distance. 44,000 yards, over 21 nautical miles, no moonlight to guide, no optical sights piercing the darkness, just a secret radar system sweeping the horizon. She locks on to the Japanese battleship Yamashiro, opens fire at 22,800 yards. Each shell, weighing 2,700 pounds, arcs through the night sky for more than 30 seconds. In that time, the target steams ahead 400 yards. No digital computers, no satellite guidance, just an analog fire control system, optical backups, and radar plotting the enemy's every move. The first salvo strikes true. It rips through the superstructure, ignites fires that rage across decks, and cripples the Japanese vessel. Her speed drops from 20 knots to a staggering crawl. Teamed with other American ships, Yamashiro sinks in just 15 minutes, dragging the cruiser Mogami down with her. This hit, at 22,800 yards, stands as one of the longest direct strikes between moving battleships in the Pacific theater, and it marks the final battleship versus battleship clash in history. Yet, this American ship, designed back in 1923, was deemed outdated compared to Japan's super battleship Yamato, armed with 18.1-inch guns, the largest ever built. No new prototypes, no cutting-edge overhauls beyond radar upgrades, just recycled turrets from a bygone era. That is the paradox at the heart of this story. How did an obsolete American battleship from 1923 outgun Japan, the naval powerhouse with the world's mightiest guns? In World War II, the answer starts in the naval arms race of the 1920s, a high-stakes gamble that reshaped the Pacific War. But before we dive deeper, imagine the tension on that bridge. Radar pings echoing, crews holding their breath as shells vanish into the night. One hit changed everything, and it proved that sometimes old iron with new eyes can outsmart the giants. Stay with us as we uncover the full tale. By the 1920s, the naval landscape of the Pacific was a powder keg, fueled by rising tensions between two emerging superpowers, the United States and Japan. Both nations eyed each other warily, building fleets that could dominate the vast ocean expanses. But the aftermath of the First World War brought constraints. In 1922, the Washington Naval Treaty was signed, a pact designed to prevent another arms race like the one that had engulfed Europe. It limited the size and number of battleships for major powers, including America, Britain, and Japan. Under the treaty, the United States was capped at a certain tonnage for capital ships, forcing a halt to new constructions beyond what was already underway. This is where the Colorado-class battleships enter the story. USS West Virginia, commissioned in 1923, was one of the last of this class. A trio that included Colorado and Maryland. Designed during the late 19-teens, these ships carried 8 16-inch guns. In 4 twin turrets, a significant upgrade from the 14-inch weapons of earlier dreadnoughts. At the time, they represented American naval might, displacing 32,600 tons, capable of 21 knots, and armored with up to 13 inches of belt protection. But the treaty froze further advancements. America couldn't build bigger or better without violating the agreement. Japan, however, played a different game. Publicly complying with the treaty, they secretly harbored ambitions for supremacy. By the mid-1930s, Japan had withdrawn from the naval limitations, embarking on a clandestine program to create the ultimate battleship. Enter the Yamato class. Construction began in 1937 on what would become the largest battleships ever built. Yamato and her sister Musashi displaced over 72,000 tons fully loaded, more than twice the size of West Virginia. Their main armament, 9 18.1-inch guns capable of hurling shells over 26 miles. These were monsters of the sea, designed to outrange and outpunch any opponent. Japan poured resources into them, believing that sheer size and firepower would ensure dominance in a decisive fleet battle, a doctrine rooted in their Mahanian philosophy of naval warfare. Meanwhile, America focused on quality over quantity, but the treaty's shadow loomed large. The Colorado class, including West Virginia, seemed adequate in the 1920s, but by the 1930s, intelligence whispers suggested Japan was cheating. American admirals knew they needed an edge, but new builds like the North Carolina class were only just starting, delayed by politics and budgets. Then came the Thunderbolt, December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Japanese carrier planes struck without warning. USS West Virginia, moored in Battleship Row, took the brunt. 7 torpedoes slammed into her port side, and 2 bombs detonated above. She listed heavily, flooding rapidly. 106 crewmen perished, trapped below decks as counter-flooding saved her from capsizing. But she settled into the mud, a smoldering wreck. Many thought her finished, an outdated relic claimed by modern air power. Yet, this was no end. It was a resurrection. In May 1942, salvage teams began the Herculean task. They patched holes, pumped out water, and refloated her by June. Towed to Puget Sound Navy Yard, West Virginia underwent a transformation that would redefine her role. From 1943 to 1944, she received a complete modernization. Her superstructure was rebuilt, anti-aircraft batteries multiplied, from a handful to over 100 guns. But the true game-changer? Radar. Specifically, the Mark 8 fire control radar, a top-secret American innovation. This wasn't just detection gear. It was a predictive marvel. It could spot targets at 40,000 yards, track their speed and course, and compute firing solutions in real time, accounting for wind, roll, and even shell wear. In the dark or fog, where optical rangefinders failed beyond 20,000 yards, radar pierced through. This upgrade was a gamble. Resources were scarce in wartime. America could have scrapped West Virginia and built newer ships like the Iowa class. But Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, saw potential in revival. If the radar failed, if integration glitches persisted, she'd be a floating liability against Yamato's behemoths. It echoed the bold risks of earlier eras, like Winston Churchill's untested guns in 1912. But the bet paid off. By July 1944, West Virginia steamed back to the Pacific, recommissioned and reborn. Her crew, battle-hardened, dubbed her Wee V, a phoenix from Pearl's ashes. Japan, meanwhile, had unleashed Yamato. Commissioned in 1941, she symbolized imperial ambition. Yet, her Achilles heel was technology. Japan lagged in radar development. Their sets were primitive, limited to basic detection, not precise gunnery control. They relied on optical sights, excellent in daylight, useless at night or long range without spotters. As the war turned against Japan, desperation mounted. By October 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf loomed, the largest naval engagement ever. Japan's Shogo Plan, a last-ditch effort to crush American landings in the Philippines. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's Southern Force, including Yamashiro, an older but modernized battleship, would charge through Surigao Strait to link with the center force under Takeo Kurita, spearheaded by Yamato. Their goal, annihilate the invasion fleet. But waiting in the strait was Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's American task force, with West Virginia at the van. The stage was set for a clash, where old met new, and technology trumped tonnage. Oldendorf positioned his ships in the classic crossing the T formation, a tactical masterpiece. As Nishimura's force steamed north, blind in the darkness, American radar lit the way. What followed would prove that West Virginia's revival was no mere salvage job. It was a strategic masterstroke. But to understand how she outgunned the Japanese, we must look closer at the weapons themselves. The technical details reveal why an outdated design, paired with innovation, became unbeatable. Let's dive into the guns, the radar, and the philosophies that separated victors from the vanquished. To understand how West Virginia outgunned the Japanese, we must examine the weapons themselves. The technical specifications reveal why an outdated design from 1923, when paired with cutting-edge innovation, became an unbeatable force. Let's dive into the guns, the radar, and the design philosophies that separated the victors from the vanquished. First, consider the main armament of USS West Virginia. Her primary weapons were 8 16-inch 45 caliber guns mounted in 4 twin turrets, 2 forward and 2 aft. These were the Mark VII model, an evolution from earlier designs. Each gun weighed about 112 tons with a bore length of 60 feet. The shells they fired were armor-piercing monsters, 2,700 pounds each, packed with explosive filler. Muzzle velocity clocked in at 2,300 feet per second. On a standard charge, propelled by 540 pounds of smokeless powder. This gave them a maximum range of 23,000 yards, with the original mountings, about 13 nautical miles. But after her 1944 refit, elevations increased to 30 degrees, pushing the range to nearly 24 miles, with streamlined super-heavy shells. Rate of fire was solid, 2 rounds per minute under ideal conditions, with a cycle time as low as 30 seconds in drills. What made these guns exceptional, however, was their reliability and longevity. Each barrel could withstand 250 to 300 full-charge equivalents before needing relining, a testament to American engineering's focus on durability. The design philosophy here was straightforward. Launch the heaviest possible shell at a moderate velocity. This approach minimized barrel wear, ensured tighter shell dispersion patterns, and delivered devastating impact energy upon arrival. Penetration was formidable, capable of punching through 20 inches of face-hardened armor at 15,000 yards. Now, contrast this with Japan's crown jewel, the 18.1-inch 45 caliber guns of the Yamato class. 9 of them, arranged in 3 triple turrets, each weighing as much as a destroyer, over 2,000 tons. These were the largest naval rifles ever mounted, with shells tipping the scales at 3,220 pounds, 20% heavier than West Virginia's. Muzzle velocity soared to 2,560 feet per second, granting a theoretical maximum range of 26 miles, 45,800 yards. Rate of fire hovered between 1.5 and 2 rounds per minute, similar to the Americans. On paper, Yamato's guns seemed invincible. Superior throw weight, longer reach, and penetration that could slice through 30 inches of armor at close ranges. But here's where the cracks appear. Japan's high-velocity doctrine came at a cost. Barrel life was abysmal. Only 150 to 200 rounds before replacement. That's half or less than West Virginia's endurance. Dispersion was another Achilles heel. The extreme pressures and velocities caused shells to scatter widely, sometimes by hundreds of yards at maximum range. To compensate, Japanese gunnery officers often used ripple fire, staggering shots within a turret, but this sacrificed salvo cohesion. In contrast, American turrets employed delay coils, ensuring all guns fired simultaneously, for tight, predictable patterns. The real equalizer, though, was not the guns themselves. It was the fire control system. For West Virginia, The Mark 8 radar was revolutionary. Integrated with the Mark 34 director, this was an electromechanical analog computer that continuously calculated firing solutions. It factored in own ship's motion, target speed and bearing, wind deflection, air density, Coriolis effect, and even propellant temperature. Detection range, up to 44,000 yards for large ships. At 22,800 yards, it predicted where a 20-knot target would be 30 seconds later, with uncanny precision, even in total darkness. Japan had nothing comparable. Their radar, like the Type 22, was rudimentary, good for surface search up to 20 miles, but not for blind fire gunnery. They depended on optical rangefinders, massive stereoscopic devices that excelled in clear daylight, but faltered beyond 25,000 yards, or in poor visibility. At night, they were effectively blind. Spotter planes could help, but in the chaos of battle, they were vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. This technological gap stemmed from differing naval doctrines. America, influenced by lessons from the First World War and interwar exercises, prioritized accuracy and sustainability. They invested in electronics early, recognizing that future wars would be fought at extreme ranges and under all conditions. Japan, shaped by their victory at Tsushima in 1905, clung to the idea of the decisive battle, a close-range slugfest where bigger guns won. They poured billions into Yamato's armor and size, neglecting radar and fire control advancements. By 1944, this mismatch was glaring. West Virginia's guns, though smaller, were more reliable and, crucially, guided by eyes that never blinked. Yamato's Titans, for all their might, fired into uncertainty. These details weren't just numbers on blueprints. They played out in blood and steel during the furious engagements of the Pacific. As we turn to the combat record, you'll see how West Virginia's resurrection turned the tide in one of history's greatest naval showdowns. The Battle of Leyte Gulf awaited, where radar met resolve and an outdated ship etched her name in legend. These technical details weren't just numbers on blueprints, they played out in blood and steel during the furious engagements of the Pacific. As we turn to the combat record, you'll see how West Virginia's resurrection turned the tide in one of history's greatest naval showdowns. The Battle of Leyte Gulf awaited, where radar met resolve and an outdated ship etched her name in legend. West Virginia's combat legacy begins from her resurrection after Pearl Harbor, as detailed earlier, where she suffered heavy damage but was salvaged and refitted as a symbol of resilience. By mid-1944, she rejoined the fleet, her radar eyes scanning the horizon. Her first taste of vengeance came in the Philippines campaign. In October 1944, the Allies launched the invasion of Leyte, a stepping stone to liberate the archipelago from Japanese occupation. Japan, facing existential threat, committed nearly its entire remaining surface fleet. In Operation Shogo, a multi-pronged assault to destroy the American beachhead, the Southern Force, under Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura, included the battleships Yamashiro and Fuso, both older designs but heavily armed. Yamashiro, like her sister, carried 12 14-inch guns, modernized with improved fire control. Nishimura's mission: punch through Surigao Strait and ravage the landing forces at dawn. Opposing him was Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's Task Force 77.2, a line of 6 American battleships, including West Virginia, Tennessee, California, Maryland, Mississippi, and Pennsylvania. Oldendorf, a gunnery expert, arranged his heavies in a classic battle line positioned to cross the T, a maneuver where his broadsides could rake the enemy column, while they could only reply with forward guns. The night of October 24th to 25th was ink black, with no moon to betray positions. Nishimura's force steamed blindly northward, relying on scouts and luck. At 2:53 a.m., American PT boats and destroyers harassed the Japanese, torpedoing Fuso and damaging others. But the real ambush came at 3:02 a.m. West Virginia's Mark 8 radar painted the contacts, Yamashiro and her escorts, at 44,000 yards, beyond visual range. Oldendorf held fire, letting the enemy close. At 3:51 a.m., with the range down to 30,000 yards, destroyers launched a torpedo ambush, further crippling the Japanese. Yamashiro pressed on, her guns silent in the dark. As mentioned in the hook, West Virginia led with radar-guided salvos, firing 93 rounds accurately, contributing to Yamashiro reeling under the onslaught. Tennessee and California joined in, their own radars guiding salvos. One shell penetrated her boiler rooms, dropping her speed from 20 knots to 5. Another detonated in her magazines, triggering secondary explosions. By 4:10 a.m., she was a blazing hulk, listing heavily. At 4:19, she capsized and sank, taking over 1,000 crew with her. The cruiser, Mogami, crippled by torpedoes and shells, followed soon after. Nishimura perished with his flagship. The Southern force was annihilated. Only one destroyer escaped. Oldendorf's victory was total, with minimal American losses. He radioed famously, "My situation is, I am now retiring from the battle area. Enemy surface forces in south have been routed." This was radar's triumph. Without it, the battle might have devolved into a chaotic melee, where Japanese optics could shine in close quarters. Instead, West Virginia and her sisters fired with impunity from the shadows. But Leyte Gulf wasn't just Surigao. To the north, in the battle off Samar, Yamato herself entered the fray. Part of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, Yamato, the 72,000-ton Leviathan, stumbled upon Task Unit 77.4.3, known as Taffy 3, a group of escort carriers and destroyers. At 7 a.m. on October 25th, Yamato's lookouts spotted the Americans at 35,000 yards. She opened fire, her 18.1-inch guns thundering. The first salvos straddled the carrier. White planes, with one shell detonating underwater, causing shock damage, but no direct hit. As the range closed to 21,000 yards, Yamato scored direct hits on the destroyer Johnston, 3 shells slamming home. Yet the plucky destroyer charged on, laying smoke and torpedoes. Yamato also hit the escort carrier Gambier Bay, contributing to her sinking. But this was no decisive victory. Outnumbered and outgunned, the American tin cans and jeep carriers fought like lions, their wildcat fighters and torpedoes forcing Kurita to maneuver wildly. Yamato, dodging torpedoes, was separated from her force and failed to press the advantage. Kurita, believing he faced a larger fleet, withdrew, a tactical blunder that saved the invasion. Yamato's guns, for all their power, achieved only partial success against inferior opponents. No battleship kills, no overwhelming dominance. Her dispersion issues and lack of radar meant many salvos missed entirely. In contrast, West Virginia's precise, radar-guided fire at Surigao was a masterclass in efficiency. If you're finding this deep dive into World War II naval warfare fascinating, subscribing takes just a second and supports more content like this. Hit that button now. And let's continue. West Virginia's legend didn't end at Leyte. In December 1944, she supported landings at Mindoro, bombarding Japanese positions with her 16-inch guns. Shells cratered airfields and supply dumps, suppressing resistance. Then, in January 1945, the invasion of Luzon at Lingayen Gulf, West Virginia led the bombardment, firing over 1,000 rounds. to soften beaches and silence batteries. Her accuracy, honed by radar, demolished pillboxes and artillery, but danger lurked from above. Kamikaze attacks intensified. On January 6th, a Zero crashed into her, killing 4 and wounding dozens. Yet, her damage control teams, veterans of Pearl, contained the fires. She remained on station. February brought Iwo Jima, the volcanic fortress. West Virginia arrived on the 19th, her guns pounding Mount Suribachi and the airfield. Over 10 days, she expended thousands of shells, breaking up Japanese counterattacks and supporting Marines ashore. Her spotters, using radar and optics, adjusted fire with deadly precision. One barrage destroyed a key ammunition depot, lighting the sky for miles. Finally, Okinawa, the bloodiest amphibious assault of the Pacific. From April 1st, 1945, West Virginia anchored off the island, providing continuous fire support. Her 16-inch shells hammered caves and bunkers where Japanese defenders hid. Kamikazes swarmed like hornets. On April 6th, one struck her forward turret, killing several gunners. Another grazed her superstructure. But she endured, downing 8 aircraft with her anti-aircraft batteries. Through May and June, she fired relentlessly, her barrels glowing red from overuse. By war's end, West Virginia had steamed over 100,000 miles, fired thousands of main battery rounds, and earned 5 battle stars. Yamato's fate, meanwhile, was a tragic coda. In April 1945, during Operation 10 Go, she sortied for Okinawa, a suicide mission to beach herself as a floating battery. Intercepted by American carriers, she faced Task Force 58. Without air cover, Yamato absorbed 11 torpedoes and 7 bombs. Her magazines exploded at 2:23 p.m. on April 7th, creating a mushroom cloud visible for miles. She sank with 2,500 souls. Her guns fired sparingly, claiming no major hits. A symbol of misplaced priorities. Size over adaptability. West Virginia's combat record proves the power of revival. From Pearl's depths to Okinawa's shores, she outfought expectations. Admiral Oldendorf praised her. West Virginia's radar fire was phenomenal. Hits on the first salvo at extreme range. Even Japanese accounts noted the invisible enemy that struck from the dark. This wasn't luck. It was the marriage of sturdy 1923 engineering with 1944 innovation. As we compare her directly to rivals, the reasons for her success crystallize. Why did America's outdated battleship consistently outperform Japan's Titans? The answers lie in the metrics of war: penetration, accuracy, and endurance. Let's break it down. As we compare West Virginia directly to her rivals, the reasons for her success crystallize. Why did America's outdated battleship from 1923 consistently outperform Japan's Titans? The answers lie in the metrics of war: penetration, accuracy, endurance, and the overarching design philosophies that defined each Navy's approach. Let's break it down. Starting with raw destructive power. Penetration. The super heavy armor-piercing variant, introduced later, boosted this to 22 inches at the same range, ensuring the shell retained energy without shattering on impact, dropping to 25 at 20,000. Their heavier shells and higher velocity gave them an edge in raw punching power, about 20% better against thick belts. But this advantage diminished at extreme ranges, where air resistance sapped the lighter density projectiles. Moreover, penetration alone doesn't win battles. You must hit the target first. Here, accuracy becomes the great divider. West Virginia's fire control, bolstered by the Mark 8 radar, delivered pinpoint salvos. The analog computers adjusted for every variable, from sea swell to barrel temperature, ensuring clusters that straddled or struck home. In Surigao Strait, her first salvo at 22,800 yards, scored hits, a feat of precision in utter darkness. Japan's system lagged far behind. Yamato's optical rangefinders were world-class in daylight, with stereoscopic baselines up to 25 feet, allowing accurate spotting to 30,000 yards under ideal conditions. But without radar integration, night battles turned them impotent. Dispersion plagued their guns. At maximum range, shells could scatter over 500 yards. A football field of error. This stemmed from the high pressures in their massive chambers, which stressed barrels unevenly. Even in tests, Japanese gunnery officers noted inconsistent patterns, requiring bracketing fire to walk onto targets. In Samar, Yamato's long-range shots at 35,000 yards resulted in near misses, not the devastating blows her designers envisioned. Endurance tells another story. West Virginia's barrels lasted 250 to 300 rounds, double or triple some contemporaries. This allowed sustained bombardments, like at Iwo Jima, where she fired for days without degradation. Yamato's guns wore out after 150 to 200 shots, limiting prolonged engagements. Relining a turret at sea was impossible. It required dry dock time Japan couldn't afford late in the war. Broader comparisons reveal systemic flaws. Against her own Navy's later designs, West Virginia held her own. The Iowa class, with 16-inch 50-caliber guns, offered longer range, 38,000 yards, and higher velocity, but at the cost of increased wear. Iowa's barrels lasted about 290 rounds, similar to West Virginia, but her speed and armor made her a thoroughbred. Yet, West Virginia's refit bridged the gap. Her radar made her as effective in fire control as the newer ships. In fact, during Leyte, she outperformed some sisters without full radar upgrades. Now, pit her against other Japanese vessels. Yamashiro's 14-inch guns, while numerous, lacked range. 22,000 yards max, and her fire control was pre-radar. In Surigao, she never got a shot off before being pummeled. Similarly, other Japanese ships like the Nagato class suffered poor dispersion and lack of radar, failing to match West Virginia's edge. Italy's Littorio class, though not direct foes, mirrors Japan's mistakes. High-velocity 15-inch guns, with chronic scattering, lasting only 120 rounds. Germany's Bismarck, with 15-inch guns, managed 180 to 210 rounds, but her optics failed in foul weather. America's philosophy, reliability over extremes, echoed Britain's successful 15-inch Mark I, which outlasted rivals by double. West Virginia, reborn with electronic sight, was the apex predator. Cost factors underscore this. Yamato devoured resources equivalent to several carriers, a fleet Japan desperately needed. West Virginia's refit cost a fraction, yielding exponential returns. In every metric, from barrel life to battle effectiveness, the outdated American proved superior. Skeptics who dismissed her as obsolete were proven wrong, just as those who bet on Japanese invincibility faltered. This comparison illuminates why technology and adaptability triumph over brute force. As we wrap up with her legacy, West Virginia stands as a testament to ingenuity in the face of adversity. From the ashes of Pearl to the victory in the Pacific, her story endures. As we wrap up with her legacy, West Virginia stands as a testament to ingenuity in the face of adversity. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor to the victory in the Pacific, her story endures. A narrative of revival and resolve. Decommissioned in 1947, after the war's end, she had earned 15 battle honors, more than many of her peers. That's a tally spanning Pearl Harbor, Leyte Gulf, Lingayen, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and beyond. She was the only battleship to fight in both the first and last surface actions. of the American Pacific Campaign, from the defense of the Philippines in 1942 to the final bombardments off Japan. Her 16-inch guns, designed in the 19-teens, continued to serve long after her retirement. Turrets and barrels were recycled into the Iowa-class battleships, which saw action through the Korean War, Vietnam, and even the Gulf War in 1991. That's 68 years of service from a design penned before the Great Depression. No other naval gun in history matched that longevity in frontline duty. In contrast to West Virginia, Yamato's legacy is one of unfulfilled potential, serving only 4 years before sinking. She never sank an enemy battleship, never turned the tide in a major engagement. Her massive guns fired in anger only a handful of times, mostly at aircraft or smaller vessels. Yamato became a symbol of imperial overreach, a resource sink that could have built carriers or submarines to better counter the American advance. Today, her wreck lies in 2,000 feet of water, a relic explored by submersibles, while West Virginia's spirit lives on in museums and naval lore. The record she set at Surigao Strait, that hit at 22,800 yards, remains one of the longest confirmed direct strikes by a battleship against another in the Pacific. It wasn't the absolute farthest in history. That honor goes to the British warship at 26,000 yards. But in the context of night fighting and radar's debut, it marked a paradigm shift. Surigao itself was the last battleship versus battleship duel ever fought, a fitting swan song for the dreadnought era. Churchill's gambles in Europe found echoes in America's Pacific strategy. The decision to refit West Virginia with radar, a high-stakes bet amid wartime shortages, paid dividends beyond measure. It proved that adaptation trumps raw power, that old hulls with new technology can humble giants. Skeptics who called her outdated in 1941, who doubted the radar revolution, were proven utterly wrong. In the Mediterranean, British guns defied age. In the Pacific, American ingenuity did the same. 22,800 yards of dark sea, 30 seconds of shell flight, one salvo that echoed through history. West Virginia didn't just survive, she conquered. And in doing so, she defined the end of an era and the dawn of modern naval warfare. If this tale of triumph has captivated you, like, share, and subscribe for more dives into history's hidden heroes. Until next time, fair winds and following seas. October 25, 1944. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Zuikaku. No gunfire around him, no smoke, just open water and a radar screen showing him something he'd been waiting all night to see. The entire American Third Fleet was moving north, away from the Philippine coastline, away from the beaches where 130,000 American troops had just landed. Ozawa didn't smile. He turned and looked at his 4 carriers, their flight decks almost completely empty. He knew that within a few hours, Halsey would come back and destroy every one of them. He had accepted that before he ever left port. Here's the strangest thing about the entire Pacific War. The Japanese didn't fear Halsey because he was unbeatable. They feared him because they knew exactly what he would do, and they had built an entire battle plan around that one fact. They sacrificed 4 aircraft carriers, hundreds of pilots, a vice admiral who sailed out fully expecting to die. All of it just to pull one man out of position. But here's what almost nobody talks about. At the exact same moment Ozawa was executing that plan, the U.S. Navy's own leadership was debating whether to fire Halsey. The Japanese considered him the most dangerous man in the Pacific. His own people considered him a walking liability. Both of them were right. That's the real question this video is asking. Not whether Halsey was a hero or a villain. The question is, Why did the most perfectly designed trap in naval history still fail? And why was the only person who truly understood the answer not American? The men in this story were someone's father, someone's grandfather. If that someone is you, drop their name in the comments right now. It doesn't matter which branch. Army, Navy, Marines, Coast Guard. They deserve to have their names spoken out loud. December 8th, 1941. The USS Enterprise was coming into Pearl Harbor. Halsey stood on the bridge. He'd been at sea delivering fighter planes to the Marine garrison on Wake Island. The mission had run its course. He was on his way back. Had he arrived a day earlier, the Enterprise would have been sitting in the harbor when the bombs fell. But that morning, he wasn't thinking about that. He was looking at what was left of the Pacific Fleet. The Arizona was still burning. The Oklahoma had rolled completely upside down. The West Virginia had sunk at her moorings. An officer standing nearby later recalled, Halsey didn't say a word for a long moment. Then, in a low voice, slow and deliberate, "Before we're through with them, the Japanese language will be spoken only in hell." No reporters were there, no cameras. This was a 60-year-old man looking at the wreckage of everything he'd spent his life defending and feeling something break open inside him. America was in a full-scale panic. There's no gentler way to put it. The Pacific Fleet, the force that was supposed to stop Japan, was sitting on the ocean floor. Generals were holding emergency meetings. Senators were demanding answers. Ordinary Americans were picking up their morning papers and wondering whether Japanese troops might land on the West Coast. In that vacuum, the Navy needed something. Not a strategy, not a long-term plan. They needed a face, someone people could look at and think, at least somebody's fighting back. Halsey became that face. In February of 1942, he led the Enterprise on a hit-and-run raid against the Marshall Islands. Small in scale, didn't change much strategically, but it was the first time since Pearl Harbor that the U.S. Navy had gone on offense. Then came Guadalcanal. By October of 1942, the Marines on that island had been fighting for 2 months straight. Malaria had taken as many men as the Japanese had. Morale was collapsing. The officer in charge of the South Pacific was so worn down that Nimitz quietly flew out to relieve him. The replacement orders were waiting in a sealed envelope when Halsey's plane landed at the airfield. A staff officer who was there that day said the news spread through the base in minutes. Marines who had been too sick to stand were suddenly on their feet. One officer later wrote that it was as if someone had turned the lights back on. Halsey didn't win Guadalcanal by himself, but he made the men who were already there believe they could. By November 30th, 1942, he was on the cover of Time magazine. Within 3 months of taking command in the South Pacific, the momentum had reversed. But inside the Navy, people were seeing something else. Halsey won, but in a way that made other admirals nervous. He attacked head-on when anyone else would have pulled back. He couldn't see an opportunity without grabbing it. He didn't know when to stop. That's when Nimitz first noticed the problem, not with Halsey's ability, with his predictability. An admiral the enemy could read, no matter how talented, was an admiral who could be used against you. May of 1942. Halsey checked into a Hawaii hospital with a severe skin condition. He'd been running at full speed for months, constant stress, 2 packs of cigarettes a day, barely sleeping. His body finally gave out. The rash covered most of him. The Battle of Midway was days away. He needed to name someone to take his place, commanding the carrier force. He chose Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, a man almost nobody outside the Navy had ever heard of. Careful, methodical, nothing about him that would set off any alarm bells. Midway happened. Japan lost 4 carriers. The Americans won the battle that turned the war. And on the other side of the Pacific, a question started being asked in the meeting rooms of the Imperial Japanese Navy. What would Halsey have done differently? That wasn't a question born of contempt. That was a question born of study. And they would spend the next 2 years working out the answer, then use that answer to build the largest trap in the history of naval warfare. June 1942. News of Midway reached Tokyo. 4 carriers gone: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. The backbone of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the same 4 ships that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, sitting on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. In the war rooms of the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, nobody was talking about Spruance. Nobody knew who Spruance was. They were talking about Halsey, because Halsey was supposed to have been there. And that was what kept them up at night. Not that America had won, but that America had won with a man they hadn't prepared for. The Midway Plan had been built on the assumption that Halsey would command the American carrier defense. They knew Halsey. They had studied every engagement he'd led since February of that year. Hit fast, hit hard, never back down. They had prepared for a man who was aggressive and predictable. Spruance was different. Spruance held at a safe distance. Spruance struck and pulled back. Spruance did things that weren't in their playbook. But instead of concluding that America was dangerous because it was unpredictable, the Japanese drew a different lesson, a simpler one, and a far more dangerous one. Halsey couldn't be replaced, not because he was better than Spruance, but because he was the only man in the U.S. Navy who couldn't resist one particular thing: enemy carriers. Over the 2 years after Midway, they watched. They watched Halsey fight at Guadalcanal. They watched him raid Rabaul. They watched him lead the Third Fleet against Formosa in October of 1944, 2 straight weeks at sea, pushing the attack without pause. Every single time, the same pattern. Halsey saw a target. He hit it. Halsey saw an opportunity. He took it. Halsey saw enemy carriers, and there was not one single instance where he didn't go after them. This wasn't an ordinary weakness. Ordinary weaknesses are things like fear, inexperience, or bad information. Halsey's weakness was the opposite. He had too much courage, and courage, at a certain scale, becomes something predictable. Fall of 1944. General MacArthur was preparing to invade the Philippines. The Japanese knew this moment was coming and couldn't be avoided. If the Philippines fell, the supply line for oil from Southeast Asia would be cut. No oil meant the Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist as a fighting force. Vice Admiral Ozawa sat in front of a map. He knew he couldn't beat Halsey in a straight fight. The Third Fleet had 17 carriers. Japan had 4, and those 4 barely had any planes on their decks. Most of the trained pilots had been killed at the Philippine Sea 3 months earlier. But Ozawa didn't need to beat Halsey. He just needed to move him. And this is the moment where 2 years of watching became a weapon. Ozawa knew one thing for certain. If Halsey saw Japanese carriers, even just 4, even nearly empty, he would chase them. Not because he was reckless, but because that was who he was. That was what had won Guadalcanal. That was what had put him on the cover of Time magazine. That was what all of America called courage. Ozawa called it a lever. The plan was approved. Ozawa would lead his 4 carriers south from the north, expose his position, wait for Halsey to spot him, then run. While Halsey chased north, Vice Admiral Kurita would bring the real strike force. 5 battleships and 12 cruisers through San Bernardino Strait from the west, straight into the undefended landing fleet. Ozawa knew his force would be wiped out. He said so directly to his superiors before leaving port. His mission was sacrifice. That was how seriously they had studied one man, not to defeat him, to use him. On October 24, 1944, Ozawa sailed out with 4 nearly empty carriers, ready to die, just to make one man do exactly what he had always done. Before dawn, Ozawa brought his 4 carriers south. He ordered his radio operators to break transmission security, broadcast openly, continuously, on frequencies the Americans would be monitoring. He needed Halsey to know he was there. Nobody picked it up. Hours passed. Ozawa waited. His fleet moved slowly south, like a man walking through an open field hoping to be noticed. Still nothing. To the west, Kurita was pushing his strike force into the Sibuyan Sea. 5 battleships, 12 cruisers. The Yamato, the largest warship ever built, heading toward San Bernardino Strait. The whole plan depended on one thing. Halsey had to find Ozawa before Kurita ran out of time. But that morning, Halsey's scout planes found Kurita first. They reported back, a massive force moving into the Sibuyan Sea from the west. Halsey immediately launched wave after wave of airstrikes. Yamato took hits. The Musashi, Yamato's sister ship, absorbed 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs before going under. Late that afternoon, Halsey's pilots filed their reports. Kurita was turning around, pulling back west, threat neutralized. Halsey looked at those reports and believed them. He had no way of knowing his pilots had read it wrong. Kurita wasn't retreating. Kurita was waiting for dark. Then, at 4:40 in the afternoon, Halsey's scouts finally found Ozawa. 4 carriers, moving south, out in the open. Halsey read the report. Carriers, 4 of them, to the north. On the flag bridge of the USS New Jersey, his chief of staff later recalled, "Nobody spoke for a few seconds. Then Halsey gave the order. The entire Third Fleet, all 17 carriers, all 6 battleships, everything, north. Not a single ship left to watch San Bernardino Strait." This was the moment Ozawa had been waiting for. But he didn't know it had happened. Because Halsey didn't tell anyone. Not Admiral Kinkaid, who commanded the 7th Fleet to the south. Not Nimitz back in Hawaii. He simply left. That night, Kinkaid received a message from Halsey. Brief. Halsey mentioned he was forming Task Force 34, a powerful battleship force. Kinkaid read it and understood it to mean Task Force 34 was being left behind to guard the strait. He went to sleep believing San Bernardino was covered. It wasn't covered. 3 in the morning, October 25th. Kurita turned around for the second time. He ordered his fleet through San Bernardino Strait in total darkness. No American ships waiting on the other side. No radar contact, no picket destroyers, nothing. The strait was completely open. He came through without firing a single shot. He steamed south along the coast of Samar, still not certain Halsey had taken the bait, still not certain what was waiting on the other side of dawn. He pushed through the dark and waited for sunrise. First light came just before 6 in the morning. Kurita raised his binoculars. In front of him, no Third Fleet, no battleships, no fleet carriers. 6 slow, thin-skinned escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts, 13 ships total, built for anti-submarine patrol, not surface combat. This was Taffy 3, and they had no idea Kurita was coming. To the north, Halsey had caught up to Ozawa at dawn and started attacking. Ozawa didn't run. He turned into the attack, doing everything possible to keep Halsey occupied, keep him moving north, keep him away from Samar. Back in Hawaii, Nimitz was watching the dispatches and couldn't make sense of what he was seeing. He sent Halsey a message, "Where is Task Force 34?" Standard procedure required security padding at the end of every encrypted message. The ensign handling the transmission that morning chose a phrase that had just come to mind. "The world wonders." When the message was decoded on Halsey's flagship, the padding was never stripped out. Halsey read, "Where is Task Force 34? The world wonders." He went still. In his own memoir, Halsey wrote what happened next. "The paper rattled in my hands. I snatched off my cap, threw it on the deck, and shouted something I am ashamed to remember." His chief of staff, Rear Admiral Mick Carney, grabbed him by the shoulders. "Stop it. What the hell's the matter with you? Pull yourself together." Halsey turned the fleet south. He would not get there in time. And Ozawa, the man who had sailed out ready to die, who had sacrificed his entire fleet just to pull Halsey north, watched the Third Fleet turn away from him, then come back and sink every one of his 4 carriers. He had known this was coming before he ever left port. After the war, an American historian asked Ozawa how he felt when he learned the plan had succeeded. Ozawa kept it short. "I completed my assigned mission. That is all." 5:45 in the morning, October 25th, 1944. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague stood on the bridge of the escort carrier Fanshawe Bay. The sky was just getting light. The sea was calm. He was thinking about the morning's mission, launching planes to support the troops ashore. Then the radar operator called out, "Large contacts, northwest. A lot of them." Sprague looked up. He saw columns of smoke on the horizon, then gun turrets, then Japanese battle flags. The Yamato was roughly 15 miles out and closing fast. Sprague had 6 escort carriers, every one of them slower than any Japanese warship bearing down on him. Their planes were armed for anti-submarine work, depth charges and light torpedoes, not for fighting battleships. He had 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, thin, small, not designed for this. Kurita looked at Taffy 3 through his binoculars and thought he was looking at Halsey's fleet carriers. He ordered a full attack. Sprague did the only thing he could do. He turned east, ran, launched every plane still on deck, laid smoke, called for help on every frequency he had. Kurita's ships opened fire. Yamato's guns began going off. Enormous shell splashes erupted around Sprague's ships, red, blue, yellow, each Japanese vessel using a different dye color so their spotters could track their own rounds in the chaos. The water around Taffy 3 looked like it was boiling in 3 colors at once. The destroyer, Johnston, was the smallest ship in the screen. Her captain, Commander Ernest Evans, didn't wait for orders. He called his crew to general quarters and turned toward the Japanese fleet. Not away, toward. The Johnston charged alone into Kurita's force. She fired all 10 of her torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Kumano. 1 hit. Kumano's entire bow blew off. She dropped out of the fight. Then the Yamato's guns found the Johnston. 3 18-inch shells tore into her in the first salvo. The blasts severed 2 fingers from Evans's left hand and blew the shirt completely off his back. He moved his command to the stern and kept giving orders. She lost power, lost steering. He kept firing anyway. The other destroyers, Hoel and Heermann, followed Johnston in. They went after Japanese battleships and cruisers like they were going against equals. They knew they weren't equals. They did it anyway. To buy Sprague's carriers another few minutes to run. In the air, Taffy 3's pilots attacked without stopping. When the bombs ran out, they made dry runs to force Kurita's ships to dodge. When fuel ran low, some flew to Leyte Gulf, gassed up, and came back. Kurita couldn't make sense of what was happening. Ships this small weren't supposed to fight like this. He was convinced he was up against Halsey's main force. He was convinced Halsey was on his way back. He was convinced those aircraft were off fleet carriers. At 9:20 in the morning, after 2.5 hours of fighting, Kurita gave the order. "All ships, my course north, speed 20. He pulled out. After the war, people asked Kurita why he withdrew. He said he believed he'd been fighting the main fleet. He said he was concerned Halsey was returning. He offered several explanations. But there was one thing he never said, and maybe couldn't explain, which was that those small ships had fought in a way that wasn't in any plan he'd ever seen. The Johnston went down at 10:10 in the morning. The Hoel had already sunk. The Samuel B. Roberts went down too. Johnston alone lost 186 of her 327 sailors. Evans was never found. But Kurita had pulled out. The 130,000 men on the beaches of Leyte were still alive. To the north, Halsey had destroyed all 4 of Ozawa's carriers. The Zuikaku, the last surviving ship from the 6 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, slipped under the surface just after 2 in the afternoon. Japan lost the largest naval battle ever fought, and the most carefully engineered trap in naval history, 2 years in the making, built around one man's personality, didn't fail because Halsey made the right call. It failed because 13 small ships did something that wasn't in anybody's plan. Ozawa completed his mission. Kurita did not complete his. And Halsey, who had been lured exactly as intended, still won. Nobody planned for that. Not the Japanese, not the Americans, not Halsey himself. The night of October 25th, 1944. The battle was over. Japan had lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers. America had won. Nimitz sat in Hawaii reading the after-action reports. He read slowly. Then he wrote one sentence to Admiral King in Washington. "It never occurred to me that Halsey, knowing the composition of the ships in the Sibuyan Sea, would leave San Bernardino Strait unguarded." That was not a compliment. Behind closed doors, people started asking the question nobody wanted to put into words. If Kurita hadn't pulled back, if he'd pushed through to the landing beaches, what would have happened to those 130,000 men? Nobody answered that out loud, but everybody knew. December 1944. Halsey drove the Third Fleet into a Pacific typhoon, Typhoon Cobra. 3 destroyers went down. 790 sailors died, more than twice the number of Americans lost at Midway. 27 ships damaged, 146 aircraft gone. A court of inquiry convened. Finding Halsey bore primary responsibility. Errors in judgment committed under stress of war operations. Nimitz read the finding. He softened it. Added a passage about insufficient weather information. Halsey received no meaningful punishment. June 1945. Halsey drove the Third Fleet into another typhoon, Typhoon Viper, a second court of inquiry. This time the conclusion was direct. Recommend that Halsey be relieved of command. Nimitz didn't act on it. King didn't act on it. After the war, Nimitz put it plainly in his internal assessment. Halsey had committed serious errors in both typhoons. Only one thing had saved him: national morale considerations. That was the real answer. Around the same time, over in the European theater, General George Patton had been pulled from frontline command for nearly a year. The reason, He had slapped a hospitalized soldier who was suffering from battle fatigue once. Halsey had caused the deaths of over 1,400 men across 2 typhoons. No meaningful discipline. Not because the Navy didn't know, but because they knew something else. Halsey's name on the front page of a newspaper meant something that Nimitz's name did not. Ordinary Americans didn't know Nimitz, didn't know Spruance, didn't know King. They knew Halsey. And in a war where home front morale was itself a weapon, nobody was going to dismantle that weapon. September 2nd, 1945, Tokyo Bay, USS Missouri. Halsey stood on deck. MacArthur beside him, Nimitz beside him. The Japanese delegation came aboard. They signed the surrender documents. Halsey stood there and watched it. He had been at sea when this war began. On the bridge of the Enterprise, coming into Pearl Harbor the morning after the attack. He had watched the Arizona still burning. He had made a promise out loud on that bridge. And now, nearly 4 years later, he was standing on a battleship in Tokyo Bay while Japan put its signature on the end of everything. The man who had been there at the first hour was there at the last. He didn't say anything that morning on the Missouri. The Japanese had read him more accurately than anyone. They knew he would chase those carriers. They knew he couldn't stop himself. They built the most precisely designed trap in naval history around that knowledge. His own Navy had read him just as well. They knew he couldn't be held accountable. They knew his name was worth more than any court of inquiry's recommendation. They protected him because they needed him, not the man, the name. And Halsey, lured north exactly as the enemy intended, nearly court-martialed twice by his own government, was still standing there that morning. This isn't the story of a perfect hero. It's the story of a man that both sides, enemy and ally alike, tried to use in their own way, and in the end, neither one could use him completely. Not even him. If you had someone in your family who wore the uniform, in the Pacific, in Europe, anywhere, this is the moment. Put their name in the comments, not for us, for them. Because the only thing that separates the men in this story from the ones who were forgotten is whether someone remembered to say their name out loud. December 7th, 1941. 353 Japanese aircraft lifted off from 6 carriers in the pre-dawn darkness north of Hawaii. When it was over, the United States Pacific Fleet had lost 8 battleships, 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and nearly 200 aircraft, all sitting on the ground. Japan lost 29 planes. 29, against the most powerful naval base in the Pacific. In the days that followed, while Washington was still counting its dead, military analysts on both sides were asking the same question. How? Part of the answer was planning. Part of it was surprise. But a large part of it, a part that American pilots would spend the next 18 months learning the hard way, was a single aircraft, the Mitsubishi A6M0. And this is not a story about Pearl Harbor. This is a story about how the greatest fighter plane Japan ever built became the weapon that helped destroy them. Not because it failed, because it was too good, designed so perfectly for one moment in time that it could never survive the next. To understand what the zero meant in 1941, you have to understand what air combat looked like before it. Carrier-based fighters in the late 1930s were, by and large, compromises. They were built heavy because carriers demanded sturdy landing gear, folding wings, and the structural strength to survive a hard deck landing at sea. They were built cautious because naval doctrine still hadn't fully decided whether the airplane or the battleship was the future of sea power. The American F-4F Wildcat, the best carrier fighter the United States had at the start of the war, was a tough, reliable machine. Pilots trusted it. It was also slower than it needed to be, less maneuverable than it should have been, and outclassed, badly, by what was waiting for it over the Pacific. The Zero was something else entirely. Its range was staggering. With external drop tanks, the Zero could fly over 1,900 miles, a distance no other carrier fighter in the world could come close to matching. To put that in terms that means something, a Zero launched from a carrier off the coast of Japan could fly to Korea, engage in combat, and return home. American planners, when they first ran the numbers, assumed the Japanese must be refueling somewhere in secret. The idea that a carrier aircraft could simply fly that far didn't fit anything they thought they knew. But it was the performance in close combat that made experienced pilots go quiet when they talked about it. The Zero could turn. Not just turn well, turn in a way that defied what Western engineers believed was aerodynamically possible for a machine of its size. In a low-speed turning engagement, the kind that dominated early Pacific air combat, a Zero pilot could get behind almost anything. He didn't need superior speed, he didn't need altitude, he just had to get you into a turning fight. And if you let him do that, the engagement was already over. Commander John Thack, one of the finest naval aviators the United States produced in World War II, described his first real encounter with the Zero in simple terms. He said it felt like the other pilot wasn't following the same rules of physics. Thatch was so shaken by what he saw that he went back to his quarters, got out a box of matches, and spent the night on the floor of his cabin working out a new way to fight. A completely new tactical doctrine, built from scratch on a wooden floor with matchsticks, because the old one would get his men killed. That doctrine became known as the Thatch Weave. It is still studied today. No aircraft in the history of American naval aviation had ever forced that kind of response. Not one. The man behind the Zero was a 40-year-old engineer from Nagoya named Jiro Horikoshi. In 1937, the Imperial Japanese Navy handed him a specification that most of his colleagues considered impossible. They wanted a carrier fighter with a top speed of over 300 miles per hour. They wanted it to climb to 10,000 feet in 3.5 minutes. They wanted a range that could support operations deep over China, far beyond what any existing engine and airframe combination could provide. And they wanted it to outmaneuver and outfight every fighter currently in service anywhere in the world. Horikoshi looked at those requirements. He looked at the engines available to him, and he understood immediately that there was only one way to make all of those numbers work. He would have to cut weight, not trim it, not reduce it carefully. Cut it deeply, systematically, in places that every engineer understood were not supposed to be cut. What he built was a masterpiece, arguably the finest expression of pre-war fighter design the world had ever seen. And hidden inside every elegant line of it, inside every gram he shaved, every safety margin he erased, were 3 engineering decisions that would eventually kill thousands of the men who flew it. The Zero didn't fail Japan. Japan built it perfectly. That was the problem. In the spring of 1942, a young American intelligence officer named Joseph Rochefort was handed a translated document pulled from a downed Japanese aircraft over China. It was a maintenance manual for the Zero. Rochefort passed it to a small team of aeronautical engineers at Naval Air Station Anacostia in Washington. They read it carefully. Then they read it again. Then one of them set it down on the table and said, quietly, to no one in particular, "They didn't put any armor in it. Not reduced armor, not lighter armor, none." To understand why that mattered, you have to understand what armor meant to a fighter pilot in 1942. A German Bf-109, the backbone of the Luftwaffe, carried a steel plate behind the pilot's head, 8 millimeters thick, enough to stop a rifle-caliber round at combat range. A British Spitfire had armored glass in the windscreen and a reinforced bulkhead between the pilot and the engine. These were not luxuries. They were the lessons of Spain, of France, of the Battle of Britain, paid for in the lives of men who died without them. The Zero had none of it. No plate behind the head, no armored glass, no reinforced bulkhead. Just the pilot, a thin aluminum skin, and whatever faith he carried with him into the cockpit. There was a second omission. Most modern fighters by 1942 carried self-sealing fuel tanks, a rubber lining inside the tank that would swell and close around a bullet hole before the fuel could ignite. The technology wasn't new. The Germans had it. The British had it. The Americans had it. The Zero did not. A single incendiary round into the right place, and the aircraft became, in the words of more than one American after-action report, a flying torch. The fire was instantaneous. The pilot rarely had time to get out. Horikoshi was not careless. He was not ignorant. He understood exactly what he was trading away. The 1937 specification had left him no room to carry the weight. Armor, self-sealing tanks, reinforced structure. Add all of it together and the Zero becomes a different airplane. Slower, shorter range, less maneuverable. In other words, by the Navy's requirements, not a Zero at all. So Horikoshi made the only choice the specification allowed him. He built an aircraft optimized to never be hit. The Zero would win by not being there when the enemy pulled the trigger. It would outturn, outclimb, outrange anything it faced, and it would do so before the other pilot ever got a shot off. On paper, in 1941, against everything the Allies had, that logic was sound. The problem was that logic only works until the other side figures out the rules. It took the Americans roughly 6 months. The answer came not from a grand battle, but from a quiet, grinding process. Debrief after debrief, after-action report after after-action report. Pilots sitting across from intelligence officers in canvas-walled tents, describing in patient detail what it felt like to fight a Zero and survive. The answer, almost every time, was the same. Don't turn with it. Dive. Attack from altitude. Fire 1 burst into the cockpit or the fuel tank. Pull out and climb. Don't stay. Don't circle. Don't give it a chance to bring that turn radius to bear. 1 pass, 1 burst. Gone. The tactic had a name eventually, the boom and zoom. And it worked because the Zero, stripped of everything that might have saved its pilot, could not survive the kind of attack it was never designed to face. A single .50 caliber round through an unarmored cockpit ended the engagement. A single incendiary into an unsealed tank ended the pilot. The aircraft that had seemed almost supernatural over Pearl Harbor and the Philippines and Malaya was, when you understood its construction, not supernatural at all. It was fragile. Precisely, deliberately, necessarily fragile, because fragility was the price Horikoshi paid for everything that made it great. On June 4, 1942, a 20-year-old Japanese pilot named Tadayoshi Koga was flying escort during an attack on American positions in the Aleutian Islands. His Zero took hits from ground fire. The oil pressure dropped. He knew he wasn't going to make it back to the carrier. He brought the aircraft down on Akaton Island, a flat, grassy stretch that from altitude looked solid. It wasn't. The ground was soft. The landing gear dug in on contact. The Zero flipped forward, inverted, and Tadayoshi Koga died, not in combat, not in fire, but in the dirt of an island most Americans couldn't find on a map. His aircraft was nearly intact. A Navy salvage team reached it weeks later, pulled it free, crated it up, and shipped it to North Island Naval Air Station in San Diego. There, a team of engineers spent the next 3 months taking it apart piece by piece. They weighed every component. They measured every structural member. They documented every place where the armor should have been and wasn't. When they were done, they wrote a report that confirmed everything the pilots had already figured out in the skies over Guadalcanal. The Zero was not invincible. It was fast. It was nimble. It had extraordinary range, and it would burn or break or kill its pilot at the first serious mistake, because Jiro Horikoshi had been given a specification with no room for second chances. The Americans shared that report up and down the chain of command. Every fighter squadron in the Pacific received it. Training programs were rewritten around it. New tactics were built on top of it. The Zero hadn't changed. That was the problem the Americans were counting on, because while they were reading the Akutan report and drawing conclusions, Zero production in Japan was running at full speed, rolling the same aircraft, with the same emissions, off the same assembly lines, month after month, year after year. And the reason for that was not stubbornness or ignorance or a failure of engineering talent. It was something built into the aircraft itself, and into the organization that built it. That is the second flaw. In the fall of 1942, the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation in Bethpage, New York, received an unusual request from the United States Navy. Build us a new fighter, not an upgrade to the Wildcat, not a modification. Something new, designed from the beginning to kill the Zero. The chief engineer assigned to the project was a methodical, soft-spoken man named William Schwendler. Schwendler had read the combat reports from the Pacific. He had studied the performance data. He understood precisely what the Zero could do, and more importantly, what it couldn't. He sat down with his team and asked a question that Jiro Horikoshi had never been allowed to ask. What is this aircraft going to face 5 years from now? And how do we make sure it can handle that, too? The answer became the F-6F Hellcat. The Hellcat was, by almost every traditional measure, an inferior aircraft to the Zero. It weighed nearly twice as much. It was less maneuverable at low speed. It couldn't match the Zero's range. Experienced Japanese pilots, when they first encountered it in 1943, were not particularly impressed. They had seen heavier American fighters before. What they hadn't seen, what they couldn't see from the outside, was what Schwendler had built into the Hellcat that had nothing to do with its current performance. He had built room for a more powerful engine, room for additional armor, room for heavier armament, room for the instruments and electronics that engineers already knew were coming. The Hellcat's fuselage was wider than it needed to be. Its engine mount was stronger than its current engine required. Its electrical system had capacity well beyond what the 1942 version of the aircraft actually used. Schwendler wasn't building a fighter for 1942. He was building a platform, something that could absorb the lessons of combat and become a different, better machine without ever leaving the assembly line. Between 1942 and 1945, the Hellcat went through continuous improvement. The early model gave way to a later, faster version. Engine output increased. Armor was added. The cowling was redesigned for better cooling at high speed. Each change was driven by the same process. Pilots reported a problem, engineers proposed a solution, the solution went into production. The cycle took months, not years. The Zero, in that same period, received no comparable upgrade. Not because Japanese engineers weren't capable, not because Horikoshi hadn't seen the problem, but because the Zero's airframe, pared down to the bone to meet that 1937 specification, had no room left. The engine mount couldn't accept a significantly more powerful engine without rebuilding the entire nose section. The fuselage couldn't carry meaningful armor without pushing the center of gravity past the point where the aircraft remained controllable. The electrical system had no spare capacity for the instruments and electronics that were becoming standard on American and British fighters by 1943. Every path to improvement led to the same conclusion: you would have to build a new airplane. The Japanese knew it. In 1942, Mitsubishi began development of a true successor to the Zero, designed without the compromises that had crippled its predecessor. It first flew in May of 1944. By then, the Hellcat had been in combat for 8 months. By then, the war in the Pacific had 14 months left. The successor never entered operational service. The numbers tell the rest of the story. When the Hellcat entered combat in August of 1943, the kill ratio between American and Japanese carrier fighters was roughly even, a brutal, costly back and forth that neither side was clearly winning. By the spring of 1944, it wasn't even anymore. On June 19th and 20th, 1944, in the waters west of the Mariana Islands, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched the largest carrier airstrike of the entire Pacific War. 473 aircraft in coordinated waves aimed at the American fleet supporting the invasion of Saipan. What happened next entered the history books under a name that American pilots gave it themselves, with the casual, terrible humor of men who had stopped being afraid of something they had once feared greatly. They called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan lost somewhere between 550 and 600 aircraft over those 2 days, the exact count still debated by historians. The United States lost 23. There are battles that turn wars, and then there are battles that confirm what the math had already decided long before the first plane left the deck. Marianas was the second kind. The Hellcat that met the Zero over the Philippine Sea in June 1944 was not the Hellcat of 1942. It was faster. It was better armed. Its pilots were trained on everything 2 years of hard combat had taught. The Zero was the Zero of 1941, older, unimproved, carrying the same compromises, the same gaps in its armor, the same limits on its airframe as the day it first flew. That is what 5 years of building room looks like against 5 years of building perfection. But the machines were only part of it. Because by June of 1944, the men sitting inside the Zero were not the men of 1941 either. And that story begins not on the assembly line and not in the cockpit, but in the way Japan chose to treat the pilots who were coming home. Or rather, the ones who still could. In the summer of 1943, a Navy fighter pilot named Alex Vrasiu returned to his carrier after an engagement over the Central Pacific. He was 23 years old. He had just shot down his third Japanese aircraft. Before he had finished removing his flight gear, an intelligence officer was waiting for him with a notepad. They sat down together for 2 hours. The officer asked about the engagement from the beginning: altitude, airspeed, angle of attack, where the rounds hit, how the Japanese pilot responded, what Vrasiu did right, what he might do differently next time. He asked whether the new gun settings were working as intended. He asked whether Vrasiu had any suggestions. That conversation, or one exactly like it, was happening on every American carrier after every engagement across the entire Pacific theater. The reports were compiled, patterns were identified. Recommendations went to the manufacturer within weeks. Alex Vrasiu went on to become one of the leading aces of the Pacific War. 19 confirmed kills, the Navy Cross. A man the system had invested in understanding. On the other side of the Pacific, Saburo Sakai was preparing to fly his 64th combat mission. Sakai was, by any measure, one of the finest fighter pilots the Imperial Japanese Navy had ever produced, one of the few men alive who had been flying Zero combat missions since the very beginning, since China, since the opening days of the Pacific War. He had forgotten more about the Zero's real-world limits, the specific ways it was likely to get you killed against an opponent who had learned to fight it, than most engineers would ever know. Nobody asked him. Not in any systematic way, not with a notepad and 2 hours and a set of questions designed to turn his experience into something useful. When Sakai returned from a mission, he was given time to rest and then sent back up. His knowledge stayed with him, personal, unrecorded, inaccessible to the men designing the next version of the aircraft in a factory in Nagoya that might as well have been on the moon. This was not an accident. It was the result of 3 structural realities that ran through the Imperial Japanese military from top to bottom. The first was cultural. In the Japanese naval tradition of that era, a report of genuine failure, unvarnished, uncomfortable failure, carried a weight that went beyond professional consequence. It touched something deeper. Something that made officers at every level instinctively reshape the facts before passing them upward. Losses were minimized in the telling. Weaknesses were framed as temporary. The picture that reached senior commanders was consistently, systematically rosier than the picture that existed in the cockpits over Guadalcanal and Rabaul and the Solomons. After the catastrophic defeat at Midway in June 1942, 4 fleet carriers lost, the core of Japan's offensive air power gone in a single afternoon. The full scale of the disaster was withheld from the Japanese public for the duration of the war. Internally, the analysis that did occur was shaped more by the need to protect reputations than by the need to understand what had gone wrong. Decisions made in the months that followed were built on a foundation of information that had been quietly, carefully, fatally adjusted. The second reality was structural. Mitsubishi's design team worked in Nagoya. The war was being fought over islands most of those engineers had never seen on a map. There was no formal channel, no regular process, by which the experience of combat pilots made its way back to the drawing board in any timely way. When Horikoshi and his team eventually received performance data from active operations, it arrived months after the relevant engagements. Filtered, summarized, stripped of the specific ground-level detail that engineering decisions actually require. The men who could have told them exactly how the Zero was failing and where and why were flying the next mission. Or they were dead. The third reality was perhaps the most insidious. By 1942, the Zero was not just an aircraft, it was a symbol. It was the machine that had humiliated the United States at Pearl Harbor, that had swept the skies clean over Malaya and the Philippines, that had made Japanese air power the most feared in the Pacific. To acknowledge, formally and officially, that the Zero was falling behind, that it could no longer compete with what the Americans were flying, was not simply a technical concession. It was an admission that the strategy built around it had been wrong, that the war was going wrong. In an institution where delivering that message could end a career, or worse, nobody delivered it. Not clearly, not loudly, not in time. The consequences arrived on a precise schedule. In 1941, the average Japanese Navy fighter pilot had logged somewhere between 300 and 500 hours of flight time before entering combat. Many had combat experience from China. They were, by any standard, among the most proficient military aviators in the world. By late 1943, the attrition had become unsustainable. Those pilots, the ones who had built the legend of the Zero, were gone, dead or wounded or worn past the point of use. Replacements were coming out of training programs that had been compressed, first to 200 hours, then to 150, then lower still, because Japan was running short of the aviation fuel needed to train them properly. Young men with fewer than 150 hours in the cockpit were being sent to fly an aircraft that punished any mistake with fire or structural failure, against opponents with over 500 hours of flight time, in aircraft that were better, with tactics specifically designed to exploit every weakness the Zero had. The outcome was not a battle. It was arithmetic. Saburo Sakai survived the war. He was one of very few pilots from the early Zero squadrons who did. In his memoirs, written years after the surrender, he described watching the new pilots arrive at his unit in 1944. Boys, really, barely old enough to shave, climbing into the cockpit of an aircraft he already knew was killing men faster than the enemy was. He wrote that he wanted to tell them everything he had learned, every mistake to avoid, every situation that would get them killed before they understood what had gone wrong. He said he tried, sometimes, talking between missions, sharing what he could in the hours between flights. But there was no system for it, no structure, no process that turned what he knew into something that could change the aircraft or the training or the tactics in any way that might have mattered at the scale the war required. He knew what was wrong. He had known for 2 years. The organization around him simply had no way to hear it. 3 flaws: a frame too light to survive a single mistake, a design too perfect to accept a single improvement, and a system too rigid to act on a single honest report. Each one, alone, might have been managed. Together, they created something that could not be stopped from the inside, only from the outside. And by the time the outside arrived in force, there was one answer left, one terrible, final answer. That is what comes next. There is a word in Japanese, toko, that the Imperial Navy used in its official communications after the fall of 1944. It means, translated cleanly, special attack. It is a bureaucratic word, precise, neutral, institutional. It describes, in the language of naval administration, the act of loading an aircraft with explosives, pointing it at an enemy warship, and asking the man in the cockpit not to come back. The Americans called it kamikaze, the wind that saved Japan once, 7 centuries earlier, when a typhoon scattered the Mongol fleet before it could reach the shore. The name was chosen deliberately. It was meant to evoke destiny, providence, the hand of heaven intervening at the final hour. What it actually was, stripped of the poetry, was a logical conclusion. By late 1944, a conventional Zero attack against a properly defended American fleet had a survival rate that approached 0. The aircraft was outclassed. The pilots were undertrained. The tactics that might once have compensated for the Zero's limitations required a level of skill and experience that no longer existed in sufficient numbers to matter. A conventional attack cost Japan an aircraft and a pilot, and, more often than not, accomplished nothing. A Toko attack cost Japan an aircraft and a pilot, and had a meaningful chance of putting a ship out of action. In the calculus of a war Japan was already losing, the second option made more sense. That is the most honest way to say it. The aircraft that couldn't be fixed, flown by pilots who couldn't be properly trained, sent by a command structure that couldn't acknowledge how badly everything had gone, found its final use as a guided missile with a human being inside. 3 flaws, 1 conclusion. Between October 1944 and August 1945, these attacks sank 34 American ships and damaged nearly 370 others. They killed almost 5,000 American sailors, more than any other Japanese weapons system, in the final year of the war. By the cold measure of damage inflicted, they worked. They worked better than the Zero had in conventional combat since 1943. That fact sits in the historical record without mercy and without explanation. It simply sits there, Japan built 10,939 Zero fighters over the course of the war. Production never stopped, not when the kill ratios reversed, not when better American fighters arrived, not after the Marianas. The assembly lines kept turning out the same aircraft, the same airframe, the same compromises, the same beautiful brittle machine, because there was nothing ready to replace it and no system capable of admitting, loudly enough, that it needed to be replaced. The last Zero rolled off the line in the summer of 1945, 2 months before the surrender. Jiro Horikoshi lived until January of 1982. He spent the post-war decades in a Japan rebuilt almost entirely by the same industrial discipline that had once built his aircraft. He wrote, he lectured. He was, in the careful and somewhat melancholy way of men who outlive the things they made, reflective about the Zero. In the book he wrote about the design process, he described with the clarity that only distance allows the fundamental nature of what he had been asked to do. He had been handed requirements that no existing engine could fully satisfy. He had been given no margin for safety, no room for growth, no allowance for the possibility that the war might last longer than 6 months, or that the enemy might learn, or that the world the Zero was designed for might not be the world it would have to fight in. He had been asked to build the perfect weapon for a specific moment in time, and he had done exactly that. The failure was not in the execution, it was in the question that nobody thought to ask. What happens when the moment passes? December 7th, 1941. 353 aircraft, 29 lost. The greatest single demonstration of carrier air power the world had ever seen, and at the center of it, 10,939 times over, from that morning until the last day of the war, an aircraft with no armor behind the pilot's head, no protection for its fuel, no capacity to become anything other than exactly what it already was. The Zero didn't lose the Pacific War. Japan lost the Pacific War for many reasons that had nothing to do with any single aircraft, but the Zero is the shape of how they lost it. A nation that built something perfect and then built it again, and again, and again, and again, long after the world had moved on and made that perfection irrelevant. The Mongol fleet was real. The divine wind that scattered it was real. But winds don't come on command, and this time no one thought to ask whether the weather had changed.
A few Jap planes escaped from small dispersal fields and make a hopeless stab at ships of our task force.
The morning of February 16th, 1944, 20 miles off Truk Atoll in the Caroline Islands, through the gray haze of an early Pacific dawn, a Japanese destroyer captain stood frozen at his optical rangefinder. His ship, the Novaki, was trying desperately to slip away from the American carrier strikes that had just torn the great anchorage at Truk to pieces. Smoke still hung thick in the air. The smell of burning oil and shattered steel lingered on the breeze. Then he saw them, 2 massive silhouettes, rising slowly on the horizon. Their long, sleek profiles were unmistakable, even at this impossible distance. American battleships, Iowa class. The captain's hands tightened on the rangefinder grips until his knuckles turned white. He whispered to himself, almost in disbelief, "What in God's name are those monsters doing out here?" What happened next would shatter everything the Imperial Japanese Navy had taught its men about surface warfare for more than 40 years. At 35,700 yards, nearly 20 miles, the American ships opened fire. The shells came screaming overhead, invisible at first. Then came the towering columns of water, huge geysers, taller than the Novaki's own masts, that bracketed the little destroyer on both sides. The concussion alone rocked the ship like a toy boat in a typhoon. Salt water cascaded across the decks. Men were thrown to their knees. The rangefinder operators shouted frantically, their voices cracking with pure disbelief. "The enemy is hitting near us, from beyond the horizon." They could barely even resolve the American ships through their finest Japanese optics. The haze was too thick. The range was too great. Yet those American guns were placing 2,700-pound shells, shells that weighed as much as a small automobile, with terrifying precision. One after another, salvo after salvo. This was the USS Iowa and the USS New Jersey, and in that single moment, every assumption that Japanese battleship crews had trained for their entire careers began to crumble. They had been taught that battles were won by the sharpness of a man's eyes, the steadiness of his hand, and the quality of his rangefinder. They had been promised that no enemy would ever strike them from a distance their own guns could not reach. But on that gray morning, something impossible had just happened. Something that would change the way every Japanese sailor looked at the sea. Because the Iowa and New Jersey weren't just firing big guns, they were firing the future itself. And the Milwaukee crew, like so many others who would follow, never saw it coming. Now, let me take you back and show you exactly why this moment felt like the end of an entire era. You see, to understand why that morning felt like the world had turned upside down for those Japanese sailors, you have to go back decades, way back to 1905. The Battle of Tsushima, that single day when Admiral Togo Heihachiro took a smaller but razor-sharp Japanese fleet and absolutely annihilated the entire Russian Baltic squadron. It was one of the most lopsided victories in naval history. And from that moment on, the Imperial Japanese Navy built its entire soul around one unshakable idea. They called it Kantai Kessen, the decisive fleet battle. It wasn't just a strategy on paper. It was a religion. The belief that one perfect afternoon, one single crushing engagement, could decide the fate of an entire war. No long drawn-out campaigns, no grinding attrition. Just one glorious showdown where superior Japanese skill, superior Japanese optics, and superior Japanese fighting spirit would force the enemy to the peace table. For nearly 40 years, every ship they built, every man they trained, every round of ammunition they stored, was shaped by that single dream. By the late 1930s, that dream had grown into steel and thunder. The Yamato-class battleships, 72,000 tons of floating fortress, 18.1-inch guns, the largest ever put to sea. Each shell weighed 3,220 pounds. They could throw that monstrous projectile out to 42 kilometers under ideal conditions. These weren't just warships. They were the physical proof that Japan was destined to win the one battle that mattered. And the men who crewed them, especially the young destroyer sailors like those on the Milwaukee, were raised on that same unbreakable faith. From the moment they enlisted, the Imperial Navy picked them with surgical precision. They tested thousands of boys for two things above all else: eyesight and mathematical talent. If you could read a rangefinder scale at extreme distance or solve complex ballistic equations in your head, you were sent straight to gunnery school. They trained for years under the hot sun and the cold night watches. They learned the Type 92 fire control system inside out, a beautiful, handcrafted analog computer that took inputs from the finest stereoscopic rangefinders in the world. Those rangefinders, Japanese optics, were considered the best on Earth at the time. The crews practiced until they could measure distance, bearing, and target speed with almost supernatural accuracy. In daylight, at ranges around 20,000 yards, that was their sweet spot. Close enough to see the enemy clearly, far enough that their 18-inch guns could punch clean through armor. They drilled again and again. Spot the fall of shot, correct the range, straddle the target, finish him off. Every officer and every enlisted gunner believed the same thing in his bones. American battleships would be slower, clumsier. They would have to come across the vast Pacific on Japan's terms, exhausted, low on fuel, easy prey for the decisive battle. The Japanese Navy would choose the time. They would choose the place. And they would choose the range where their eyes and their training gave them the edge. You can almost hear the instructors drilling it into those young men. War at sea is a contest of human skill, not machines, not gadgets. Your eyes, your mind, your courage. That is what will win the day. And for a while, it looked like they were right. Early victories in 41 and 42 seemed to confirm every lesson they had ever learned. But beneath all that confidence, something was quietly changing on the other side of the ocean, something the Japanese intelligence services only caught glimpses of. America had started building a completely different kind of battleship. Not bigger for the sake of being bigger, not slower and heavier like the old standards, but fast, sleek, designed from the keel up to fight a new kind of war. A war where the enemy might never even see you before the shells started falling. The Japanese crews on ships like the Nowaki still trained the old way. They still polished their rangefinders. They still ran through their manual calculations by hand. They still believed that the decisive battle would come at medium range, in clear daylight, where a man's eyesight and a good optical computer would decide everything. They had no idea, none at all, that the rules of the game had already been rewritten, and that the Americans had decided the fight would no longer be fought with eyes alone. But to truly understand how deep that change ran, we need to step aboard those American giants and see what they brought to the Pacific that changed everything. Let me tell you, this wasn't just another battleship. This was the Iowa class, born from a very specific need back in 1939. American war planners looked at the map of the Pacific and realized something big. The next war would be fought by fast carrier task forces. Carriers were the new kings of the sea, but they were also fragile. They needed heavy escorts that could keep up with them at 33 knots, day after day, across thousands of miles of open ocean. The old battleships, those solid 27-knot veterans, simply couldn't stay in the fight. They would lag behind, leaving the carriers naked to surface raiders. So the designers in Washington did something radical. They drew up plans for a battleship that could sprint like a cruiser yet hit like a sledgehammer. 860 feet long, sleek as a racing yacht, 45,000 tons at standard load, swelling to nearly 60,000 when fully fueled and armed. 8 massive Babcock and Wilcox boilers feeding 4 General Electric turbines, 212,000 shaft horsepower. That was enough power to push those long hulls through the water at 33 knots, even in heavy seas. These ships could run down anything lighter than themselves and still stand toe-to-toe with the heaviest enemy units. But speed and size were only half the story. The real revolution, the part that would rewrite the rules of naval gunnery, sat high in the fire control tower above the main deck. 2 complete and independent systems, forward and aft. Each one had its own director, its own plotting room, and its own data links running through armored cables. At first glance, you might think it was just the usual optical sights and rangefinders. Mark 48 stereoscopic rangefinders, good ones, the kind every battleship carried. But sitting right on top, looking almost like an afterthought, was something that changed the game forever. The Mark 8 fire control radar. Now listen close, because this little box did what no human eye could ever do. It could lock onto a target at 45,000 yards, through rain, through fog, through total darkness, and keep tracking it while both ships raced at full speed. That radar data fed straight into the heart of the system. The Mark 8 Rangekeeper, an electromechanical analog computer the size of a large desk, filled with spinning gears, differential cams, and precision motors. This machine didn't just measure distance. It calculated everything. In real time. Target speed, target bearing, range rate, how fast the distance was changing, wind, direction, and velocity at every altitude the shell would fly through, air temperature, barometric pressure, even the rotation of the Earth itself. That tiny Coriolis effect over a 20-mile arc, all of it. Solved. Continuously. Updated every second. And here's the part that still gives old gunners chills. The system used remote power control. The guns didn't need men cranking wheels anymore. They followed the director automatically, training and elevating in perfect sync while the ship rolled and pitched at high speed. Gyroscopic, stable vertical elements kept the whole solution steady, no matter how hard the Iowa turned or how rough the sea got. In practical terms, an Iowa-class battleship could detect a target, build a complete firing solution, and put 9 16-inch shells on the money, without a single man ever laying eyes on the enemy. The shells themselves, 2,700 pounds of armor-piercing steel, were hurled out at 2,800 feet per second. They climbed miles into the sky, then plunged down from beyond the visible horizon, and the system kept correcting, salvo after salvo, even while the target zigzagged for its life. This wasn't just better gunnery. This was a completely new philosophy. Where older ships relied on human eyesight and manual corrections, the Iowa class turned naval gunfire into a science, automated, integrated, relentless. It was designed for the kind of war the Pacific would actually become, not the kind anyone had fought before. Night actions, long-range duels in heavy weather, escorting carriers while still ready to smash any surface threat that dared come close. Those two ships, Iowa and New Jersey, carried more than just big guns and thick armor. They carried the future. A future where the man behind the rangefinder no longer decided the battle. The machine did. And that machine, quietly spinning away in its armored plotting room, was about to give the Japanese Navy the shock of its life. Because on that gray morning off Truk, the old world of naval warfare was about to meet the new one, head on, and meet it they did. At exactly 9:36 that morning, the directors had already swung into position. Fire control radars painted the contacts solid and steady at 36,000 yards. The range keepers began their quiet spinning, feeding every variable into the solution faster than any human brain could follow. Wind at altitude, temperature layers, the tiny drift from Earth's rotation, the exact rate at which the Japanese ships were pulling away. All of it locked in. Then the Iowa and New Jersey spoke. 9 16-inch guns on each ship roared as one. The recoil shook the massive hulls like they weighed nothing. Those 2,700-pound shells climbed miles into the sky, invisible for nearly 30 seconds, before they began their long plunge back toward the sea. Aboard the Milwaukee, the first real hammer blows arrived moments later. Not direct hits yet, but close enough to drench the entire forward deck in walls of white water. Men were slammed against bulkheads. The captain bellowed over the roar. Full speed, hard to port, zigzag pattern alpha. The little destroyer heeled over so sharply that loose gear flew across the decks. Smoke generators kicked in, thick black clouds billowing from her stacks. She twisted. She turned. She ran for her life at 35 knots, but something terrifying was happening. Every time the Milwaukee changed course, the American rangekeepers already knew. The radar kept feeding fresh bearings and ranges every single second. The analog computers adjusted elevation and train automatically. The guns on Iowa and New Jersey followed without a single hand touching the controls. It was as if the shells themselves were alive, learning the destroyer's every desperate move before she even finished making it. Salvo after salvo walked closer. Near misses became straddles, towering geysers, some of them 300 feet high. erupted all around the Nowaki. The concussion alone was enough to buckle hull plates and rupture watertight doors below decks. Inside the Japanese plotting room, the officers were shouting over each other. "Range correction! Plus 200! Bearing drift, 0.5 left." Their hands flew across the manual dials of the Type 92 computer, trying to guess where the next American shells would fall. But they were always one step behind. The American system wasn't guessing, it was calculating, and it never stopped. The Iowa and New Jersey shifted their fire slightly. Just a few degrees. The light cruiser Katori was running nearby, trying to screen the destroyers. She never had a chance. The first American salvo straddled her perfectly. Then came the second, and the third. 16-inch armor-piercing shells, moving at 2,800 feet per second, tore through her thin cruiser plating like it was cardboard. Flames erupted from her engine spaces. Secondary explosions ripped open her decks. Within minutes, the Katori was a blazing wreck, listing hard to starboard, her crew leaping into the oil-slick water. The American battleships didn't pause. Their radars simply painted the next target. The destroyer Musashi was next. She tried the same desperate zigzags the Nowaki had used. It made no difference. 3 straddles in a row, then 2 direct hits amidships. The big shells punched straight through her hull, detonated deep inside, and tore the ship apart from the inside out. She went down in less than 4 minutes, taking most of her crew with her. Then came the auxiliary cruiser Akagi Maru. She was slower, heavier, laden with supplies. 1 salvo, 2, and she was burning from bow to stern. Her captain radioed a frantic last message before the ship rolled over and disappeared beneath the waves. All the while, the Nowaki kept running. Her captain, a veteran who had survived earlier battles, was now screaming orders that grew more desperate with every passing minute. "Smoke to maximum, hard starboard. Now port. Don't hold any course longer than 30 seconds. The crew was exhausted, soaked in seawater and sweat, ears ringing from the constant thunder overhead. Every man aboard knew the truth in his gut. They were being hunted by something they could not see, something that never missed its guess. The American shells kept coming. Some screamed just over the mastheads, so close the crew could feel the hot wind of their passage. Others plunged into the sea only yards away, sending up columns of spray that rained down like a tropical storm. One near miss lifted the Nowaki's stern completely out of the water, then slammed it back down so hard that rivets popped loose in the engine room. The chief engineer reported flooding in 2 compartments. Still, the ship kept moving. Still, the American guns kept adjusting. At one point, the Iowa and New Jersey achieved something that would stand as a record for the entire war: the longest range straddle in naval history, 35,700 yards, over 20 miles. The shells landed so precisely on either side of the Nowaki that the columns of water actually touched above her deck, forming a momentary cage of white death. The captain later wrote in his report, "It was as if the enemy could read our minds." But it wasn't mind reading. It was the Mark 8 radar painting every turn, the rangekeeper calculating every change in speed, the gyro stabilizers keeping the solution rock steady, while the Iowa herself sliced through the waves at full battle. Speed. The Japanese had nothing to answer with. Their own guns, even if they could have ranged the Americans, were firing blind. Their optics could barely make out the distant smudges on the horizon through the haze and smoke. And every time they tried to steady up for a return shot, another American salvo arrived first. By 10:15, the Nowaki was alone. The Katori, the Musashi, the Akagi Maru, all gone. Only smoke and burning oil marked where they had fought their last minutes. The Nowaki's captain made the only decision left. He ordered a radical turn due north, straight into the thickest smoke bank he could find. and pushed the engines to the absolute limit. For the next 20 minutes, the destroyer twisted and vanished and reappeared, using every trick in the book. And somehow, by the grace of that smoke, by the grace of distance, and by the sheer exhaustion of the American gun crews, the Milwaukee slipped away. She would survive the day, battered, leaking, but still afloat. Her captain would file one of the most sobering reports the Imperial Japanese Navy ever received. He described accurate gunfire at ranges his own rangefinders could not even measure. He described shells arriving from beyond the visible horizon, guided by something his crew could never see. He described a level of fire control precision that made every lesson they had ever learned feel suddenly, terribly, obsolete. That report would be read in Tokyo within days. It would circulate through every battleship wardroom, every gunnery school, every plotting room from Yokohama to Truk. And for the first time, senior Japanese officers began to write in private memos words they had never dared speak aloud before. The enemy possesses gunnery capabilities that exceed our tactical assumptions. They were right. But by February of 1944, it was already too late to change the answer. The old world of naval warfare, the world of eyes and optics and human skill, had just been sent to the bottom along with the Katori and the Maikaze. And the new world, the world of radar and analog computers and shells that found their targets in the dark, had only just begun to speak. The Milwaukee had escaped, but the lesson she carried home would haunt every Japanese battleship crew for the rest of the war. And that lesson was only going to get louder. Word of what happened that morning spread through the Imperial Japanese Navy faster than any official dispatch ever could. The Milwaukee's captain filed his report within hours of reaching safety. By the time it reached Tokyo, every senior staff officer in the Naval General Staff had a copy on his desk. They read it in silence. Some of them read it twice. One veteran admiral later admitted in a private post-war letter that the pages felt heavier than any battle damage report he had ever held. Because this wasn't just another ship that had taken a beating. This was proof that the very foundation they had built their entire navy upon had suddenly cracked wide open. The memo that circulated next was blunt in a way Japanese naval documents rarely allowed themselves to be. The enemy possesses gunnery capabilities that exceed our tactical assumptions. That single sentence was underlined in red by more than one hand in the high command. They could no longer pretend the Americans were fighting the same war. The old, comforting belief that Japanese eyes, Japanese optics, and Japanese discipline would always win at the ranges that mattered was dying right in front of them. But the real wound wasn't felt in Tokyo's marble corridors. It was felt in the gun rooms, the plotting compartments, and the rangefinder stations of every Japanese warship still afloat. Word traveled ship to ship, mess deck to mess deck. Destroyer men told cruiser men told battleship men. And the battleship men, the ones who had spent their whole adult lives believing they were the ultimate expression of Japanese naval power, suddenly found themselves staring at the deck plates in stunned silence. One of those men was a senior gunnery officer who survived the war and gave a long interview in 1952. I still remember the way his voice changed when he spoke about that report. He said, "We had trained until we could measure distances in our sleep. We could calculate firing solutions faster than most men could add 2 and 2. We polished our rangefinders until the lenses felt like part of our own eyes. We were told that courage and skill would always overcome machines. Then we read what happened to the Milwaukee, and we understood that our entire life's work had just been made obsolete in a single morning." He paused for a long time on the recording. You can hear him draw a slow breath before he continued. It wasn't fear. It was something worse. It was futility. That word futility appears again and again in the private diaries and post-war recollections of Japanese sailors from 44 onward. They had joined the Navy as boys, believing they were joining the finest gunnery service on earth. They had spent years mastering systems they were told were unbeatable, and now they were being told quietly, in officers' messes and over late-night cups of bitter tea, that the Americans had built something their training could never match. Not because the Americans were braver, not because their crews were better, but because the Americans had stopped relying on human eyes altogether. The rangefinder operators felt it most personally. These were the elite, the men chosen for their perfect vision. One of them, a petty officer who later became a schoolteacher in Kyushu, described it this way: "I used to feel like a god when I had a clear target in my lenses. The world narrowed down to two tiny images coming together in perfect focus. I could call out ranges that decided the life or death of enemy ships. After Truk, I realized I had become a blind man with the finest binoculars in the world. The Americans didn't need to see us. They simply knew where we were." You can hear the quiet heartbreak in those words even decades later. It wasn't anger at their own navy. It was a deeper sadness, the realization that everything they had sacrificed, every hour of grinding practice under the tropical sun, every night spent calculating ballistics by lantern light, had been aimed at a kind of war that no longer existed. The High Command tried to respond the only way they knew how. They ordered more training. They demanded tighter optical drills. They even rushed new radar sets to a few capital ships. But the men in the plotting rooms knew the truth. Their radar was never integrated the way the American system was. It remained an aid, something extra, while the Americans had made radar the heart of the entire machine. And that difference, that quiet, technical difference, had just cost them 3 ships in a single morning. By the spring of '44, a strange new atmosphere settled over the Japanese fleet. The old proud confidence was still there on the surface. Men still saluted smartly. They still sang the battle hymns. But underneath, something had broken. They had seen the future arrive in the form of 2 gray silhouettes on a hazy horizon, and the future had not needed their eyes at all. The Nawaki had escaped with her life, but the Imperial Japanese Navy would never escape the lesson she brought home. And that lesson was about to be repeated, louder, across the rest of the Pacific. That quiet heartbreak didn't stay locked inside the fleet for long. The same cold truth that hit the Nawaki's crew began to repeat itself, louder and more final, in every major battle that followed. By October 1944, the Japanese High Command threw everything they had left into the biggest naval fight in history, Leyte Gulf. They sent the super battleships Yamato and Musashi straight into the meat grinder. These were the ships they had saved for the one decisive afternoon they had dreamed about since 1905. 18.1-inch guns, 3,220-pound shells, armor thick enough to stop almost anything ever built. But when the American carrier planes found them in the Sibuyan Sea, something had already changed. Musashi took 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs before she finally rolled over and sank. She never even got close enough to fire her main guns at an American capital ship. Yamato fought on, but even she discovered the same brutal fact the Nawaki crew had learned 8 months earlier. Whenever American fast battleships appeared on the horizon, even at extreme range, the Japanese optical systems simply could not keep up. The Iowa-class ships were never forced into the kind of daylight slugfest the Japanese had trained for. Instead, they stayed just far enough away that their radar-directed guns could reach out and touch targets the Japanese could barely see. The old doctrine died that day, not in one grand explosion, but in the slow, grinding realization that the decisive battle would never come on Japan's terms. Then came the island campaigns. Iwo Jima, in February 1945. Before a single Marine set foot on the black sand, American battleships, including the Iowas, laid down days of continuous fire. They used high-capacity shells now, 1,900 pounds each, packed with explosive, meant to shatter concrete and bury men alive. Each impact carved craters 50 feet wide and 20 feet deep. The blast wave stripped trees bare 400 yards away. Japanese defenders huddled in their reinforced bunkers, tunnels carved into volcanic rock, positions they had spent months building. They waited for the ships to come into range of their coastal guns. The ships never did. The Americans stayed 20,000 yards offshore, beyond the reach of most Japanese artillery, and kept firing with radar-guided precision. The defenders could only listen as the earth shook hour after hour. One Japanese artillery officer later wrote in his diary, a page stained with ash and sweat. The American guns fire without pause. We cannot see the ships. We cannot hit them. We can only dig deeper and pray. Okinawa was worse. Missouri and Wisconsin alone poured more than 500 16-inch rounds into the island before the landings even began. The same story played out, only on a larger scale. Ammunition dumps vanished in fireballs. Artillery positions disappeared under tons of rubble. Command bunkers collapsed. The Japanese had studied every previous invasion. They had dug deeper, hidden better, prepared for the worst. It still wasn't enough, because the Americans weren't fighting with eyes and courage anymore. They were fighting with machines that could see through smoke, through rain, through night, and place shell after shell exactly where it hurt most. And then, in July 1945, the ultimate humiliation. American battleships, Iowa, Missouri, Wisconsin among them, sailed right up to the coast of Japan itself. They shelled the steelworks at Muroran in Hokkaido. They pounded industrial targets at Hitachi, only 80 miles from Tokyo. Japanese coastal batteries fired back desperately. Not a single American ship was hit. The big 16-inch guns simply kept working, directed by radar, while the Japanese defenders watched helplessly from shore. One Japanese war minister was forced to make a formal apology to the emperor for the Navy's inability to stop the attacks. The home islands, the sacred soil, were being shelled like target practice, and there was nothing left to answer with. By the summer of '45, the message was unmistakable. The lesson the Nawaki had carried home in February '44 had traveled all the way from Truk to the shores of Japan. The age of the decisive battleship duel was over, and the Iowa class had written its final chapter. But there was still one more thing those ships had to do before the guns fell silent forever. On the 2nd of September, 1945, in Tokyo Bay, the instrument of Japanese surrender was signed aboard the USS Missouri, an Iowa-class battleship, the newest and most powerful class America had ever put to sea. Japanese officials walked across her deck, past those massive 16-inch gun turrets, and formally ended the war right there in the shadow of American naval power. The choice of venue was no accident. It was deliberate. It was final. The war that had begun with Japanese confidence in the Kantai-Kessen doctrine ended under the guns of ships that had rendered that doctrine completely obsolete. Think about that for a moment. The Novaki's crew never imagined that American battleships could reach out 20 miles and strike with precision their own rangefinders could never match. They had trained their whole lives for a different kind of fight, a fight at medium range, in clear daylight, where eyes and courage decided everything. The Americans never gave them that fight. Instead, they brought radar, analog computers, and a completely new way of waging war at sea. They prepared for the war they actually got, not the war everyone expected. And that single difference changed history. The Iowa class didn't just win battles. They changed what battles even meant. They served in Korea, pouring accurate fire onto enemy positions when the Army needed them most. They came back in Vietnam, where the New Jersey alone fired more 16-inch shells than most cruisers fired in their entire careers. And then, incredibly, all 4 of them were modernized in the 1980s, fitted with Tomahawk missiles and Harpoon anti-ship weapons, and sent to the Gulf War in 1991. Missouri and Wisconsin fired both cruise missiles and those same 16-inch guns at Iraqi targets. A World War II battleship coordinating tomahawk strikes. That is how well these ships were built. They didn't become museum pieces when the war ended. They kept working. They kept evolving. Today, all 4 Iowa-class battleships are preserved as memorials. Iowa in Los Angeles, New Jersey in Camden, Missouri in Pearl Harbor, right beside the Arizona, Wisconsin in Norfolk. Visitors walk their decks. They stand beside those silent 16-inch guns. They look at the fire control towers where the Mark 8 radar once turned night into day. And sometimes, very quietly, an elderly Japanese veteran will make the long journey to stand on that deck. He will run his hand along the steel. He will look out at the horizon, and he will nod, as if finally making peace with something he carried for 70 years. Because those ships didn't just defeat an enemy navy, they defeated an entire way of thinking. They proved that in modern war, the better system beats the better warrior. The Iowa class was never the biggest, never the most heavily armed, but they were the smartest, the fastest, the most adaptable, and in the end, that was what mattered. The thunder of those 2,700-pound shells still echoes through history, not as a sound of destruction, but as a warning. A reminder that the most dangerous thing any navy can do is prepare perfectly for the last war. The Noaki's crew learned that the hard way on a hazy morning in 1944. Every sailor who came after them learned it again, and every navy that sails today would do well to remember it. Because the next time the guns speak, they may not speak with eyes. They may speak with something we haven't even imagined yet. Thank you for watching. If this story touched something in you, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Let me know in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from today? And remember, the sea never forgets. Neither should we.